Hi, everyone. How you doing this morning? Good? Doing average. Well, hopefully it's awesome by the end of the talk. So, my name is Larry Garfield. You may know me online as Krell. If you want to make fun of me during the talk on Twitter, that's where you do so. I highly encourage it. I'm a senior architect with Palantir.net. We're a full service agency based in Chicago, mostly Drupal, not exclusively. Design, development, site build, everything but hosting we do. For those of you who were at the FIG meeting yesterday, I'm the Drupal representative to the Framework Interoperability Group. Who here is not familiar with FIG? Couple of people? So think the United Nations of PHP with all the good and bad implications that it has. I'm also getting caught in my cable here. Also advisor to the Drupal Association. And I do implement PSR 8, which is the huggable interface. So just in case you were wondering. So we're all here to learn, right? Right? Okay. What are we here to learn? What we're here to learn is how to make code that looks like this. Those of you who were around for keynote karaoke last night, you're going to recognize some of these slides. Right? Clean, separable, stack everything together like Legos, so simple that kids can do it. You know, this is our goal, right? Now let's be honest. Who here is going home to code that looks like this? About half of you are going to admit to it. So if we're here, how do we get to here? This is really the goal. How do we get to here from here? And you know, this is part of our job as developers, is to clean up the spaghetti that exists in the world. And I'm here to say that it is possible. It is, in fact, possible to evolve from spaghetti to Legos. And it feels weird to say that, but how do you do that? What's your guideline? How do you go about that? Well, how do we define something that's a Lego versus spaghetti? How do we differentiate that kind of code? The guideline I would suggest for that is testability. How do we evolve our code? Evolve it towards testable code. Why? Well, Grumpy, you here? There he is. For one thing, he will hurt you if you don't. But besides that, we can use testable as a proxy for all of these other things. Testable code tends to be more decoupled. Testable code tends to be easier to understand. Testable code tends to be cleaner. Testable code is easier to reuse. Testable is a good stand-in for good. It's a good guideline and metric to work with. If it's hard to test, you're probably doing it wrong. You know, a good example here, if you're familiar with, on the front end, you've got semantic markup, which is a good thing. You've got accessible markup, which is a good thing. You want it to be SEO friendly. Those are not the same thing, but they're all close enough, and they overlap enough that if you target one of them, you're probably going to do pretty well on the other two. So pick one and just drive that, and you'll probably do pretty well. Don't focus on SEO, focus on accessibility. The SEO will come with it. Same kind of idea here. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a Drupal developer. This is my day job and my night job and my weekend job. Who's used Drupal 7? Actually, who are the Drupal people in the room here? Couple? Okay, decent number. I'm going to be talking about us today. So Drupal 7 is a PHP 4 era application. Architecturally, it's a PHP 4 app. It requires PHP 5, but architecturally, it's a procedural PHP 4 system that's built on arrays as the ultimate data structure of all the things. We had lots and lots of functional tests and integration tests, but pretty much no unit tests to speak of in Drupal 7, maybe 4. Those who have worked with it will agree with me. A very idiomatic architecture, very idiomatic API, very flexible, very extensible, but different, right? Despite that, Drupal 7 runs 2% of the web, which is a pretty big deal. And if you're looking at large sites, it's something like 15% of the top 1,000 sites are Drupal. So it's a very successful project with a huge community. Just the people who wrote code for Drupal 7 itself was nearly 1,000 people. That is huge by any standard. So we're talking about a very powerful system, but to be perfectly honest, you can't read that with the sunlight here. It says staining at the seams. Drupal 8 is coming out real soon now. And it's a completely different animal. It's architecturally fairly clean, object-oriented. We have over 8,000 unit tests, still lots of functional tests, but over 8,000 unit tests and counting. That number goes up daily. It's much more flexible architecture, even more flexible than the arrays we had before. Built on much more modern standards, the kind of code you're familiar with if you're working in Symfony, Zend, Laravel, any of these other modern systems, it's going to be much more familiar to you. And it embraces Pi, proudly invented elsewhere. Because let's face it, everybody loves Pi, right? And over 3,000 people who have contributed code, just code, to the code base. This is a huge turnaround. This is a massive, massive change. How does one do that? How does one turn around a project that size from 15-year-old procedural arrays to a modern object-oriented system? This is a big job. Well, how do you do big jobs? How does one eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And it helps to have friends. Lots and lots of friends. This is DrupalCon Portland in 2012, and you totally can't see this with the sunlight. Oh, you have TVs, okay. Don't look at me, watch TV instead. So, how did we get 3,000 people to do this? Well, it starts with whiskey, and I don't mean the alcoholic kind. I mean the Web Services and Context Core Initiative. This is the core initiative that I was running for Drupal 8. We called it whiskey because I don't drink, and I love jokes, especially bad ones. But our mission statement for this initiative was Drupal needs to evolve quickly from a first-class web CMS into a first-class REST server that includes a CMS. Because that's where the web is these days. Pages are no longer a thing. Requests and responses are. How do we do that? Well, the thing I want to call out here is that the goal was functionality. The goal was not, let's rewrite stuff for the sake of rewriting it. The goal was new functionality. But we said, all right, we're doing a lot of big work. Let's do it right this time. Let's modernize this part. Want to do the new stuff the right way and try and make that example to the rest of the system. And we said, we can't be the first ones to try and write this kind of code, to do things in a modern way and do proper handling of HTTP and all that kind of fun stuff. So is there anything else we can leverage? Anything else we can build on? And that led us to Symfony. First thing we pulled in was just the basic HTTP foundation library. Then after a little bit, we said, you know what? In for a penny, in for a pound. Let's pull in the whole Symfony kernel pipeline and just let that snowball. Let's let that ripple out through the rest of the system. We've replaced not invented here with proudly invented elsewhere. This is, I think, a complete list. No, it's not a complete list. It's just the big stuff that we're pulling in from other projects. Symfony, Zend, Doctrine, Guzzle, Twig, PHP Unit, another Zend library. This is a huge shift for any project. This is modern PHP at work. And having spent the last 4 years working on this, I want to help you learn from our experiences in this process. And by experiences, I of course mean mistakes, because let's face it, we didn't do everything right. We're humans, even if it doesn't seem like it at times. And probably the most important lesson to take away from this process, from our experience, that you can take back with you, is that refactoring is a social challenge. It is not a technical challenge. It is a social challenge and governance challenge. This doesn't matter whether you're an open source project or if it's an in-house project of your company. You need to have, the big blocker is going to be social. You need to have buy-in from leadership. If you're an open source project, yes, you still have leadership, even if you don't admit to it. Because if you try to do it just in bits and pieces, kind of on the side and underhanded, it's going to be very short-lived, because the rest of the cruft is just going to cover up your work all the time. So, first guideline, first rule. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So what is your plan? Are you refactoring to improve the code base, or are you adding features and refactoring along the way? In our case, in Drupal's case, we wanted functionality. We wanted a new routing system that could handle things other than HTML pages. That was our goal, and doing it in this newfangled way was a means to an end. Which meant that a lot of people were kind of taken by surprise when suddenly, wait a minute, what are all these classes doing in the middle of my code base? We didn't do any refactoring for its own sake early on. That came later once people realized the benefits of it, but that case had to be made first. People need to see the value of change. Change does not happen unless people see a value of it. The developers on the team need to see value. They need to learn something new. They need to see a reason why they do so. The management needs to see value. Whether you're a commercial company, management is your boss, or you're an open source project, Drupal has management. It doesn't like to admit it, but it has management. But you need buy-in. Because people will say, is refactoring valuable? And you need to be able to make that case. Is improving the code base worth the effort? You'll probably hear someone make this statement. I've heard people make this statement for years. Code quality doesn't matter, only user experience matters. Who's heard that line? Yeah. BS. Why? Because developers are users. Developers are users of code. If the code is hard to work with, your developers cannot write good user-facing functionality. You have to make life easier for the people working on the system so that they can make life easier for someone else. Technical debt in the system inhibits your ability to serve the users. This is not an easy lesson to learn. There are a lot of people who push back against it because they don't see the connection. Probably the hardest thing is convincing people that time invested in improving the quality of the code is time invested in improving the quality of life for users. That's the case you have to make. Because you can say the new code will be better, and you can say that, but people are going to say, prove it. Okay, so we proved it. In our case, our first major refactor was the Drupal 7 database layer. This is a completely homegrown system. Sorry, Doctrine. At the time, Doctrine was just an ORM. It wasn't just a DBL, so we couldn't use it. This is actually what I worked on in Drupal 7. And it was almost entirely object-oriented. It was the only seriously object-oriented system in Drupal 7. But it meant people got to see it. People got to see, okay, this isn't scary. I can work with this. In fact, several cases when people are porting modules from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, they said, I just ripped out 800 lines of code because of this new fancy OO system, because it does work better. It is more efficient, it is more flexible, it is easier to work with. But people needed that initial taste, that initial touch to get over their fear of the class keyword. This was in 2008 we started working on it. Yeah, I've been working on this for a very long time. The really big change, though, came early in the Drupal 8 development cycle. This was part of the Web Services Initiative. Our old routing system only knew how to route based on paths. That's it. If you wanted to do something different based on an accept header, based on a HTTP method, or any of the things that you kind of have to do if you want to do proper REST, it couldn't. So there were actually several different systems built on top of that, all incompatible with each other that people used. So all right, let's fix that. Let's do it in core. We needed to make our routing system RESTful. And pretty much, this was all Symfony code. Some extensions, actually. We collaborated with the Symfony CMF project on their routing system. So we're using the Symfony CMF router, and anyone else using the Symfony CMF router is using Drupal work. Because really, the world did not need another request system, another request response system, so we just used an existing one. Basically, the idea here, let's take HTTP kernel, which is the Symfony core system, and fairly well built. It's a nice, clean system. Let's just drop it in the middle of the code base and see what happens. Because really, we're making the old code feel clunkier in comparison. By letting people see both the old procedural way and the new object-oriented way, they get a taste for it. They feel it. They can feel the difference and say, oh, this really is nicer. I do want to refactor this old piece of code to be like this one so it fits nicer. I have to refactor this piece here so I can keep this part clean and nicely testable. Having them side by side there is valuable. But, and this is very important, you're shaming the old code, not the old coders. Again, open source or commercial, the same thing applies. You do not want to shame the old developers. Why? Well, first of all, there's a 50-50 chance that you wrote the code in the first place. More importantly, though, you don't want to make enemies. You want people to, you want converts. You want people to realize, yes, this new system is better, and I want to work with it. I want to be part of this. Not someone who's going to fight you every step of the way because you are being a dick to them. Don't be a dick to people. It backfires. So there's two different ways we did this. One bottom up, one top down. Taking a bottom up approach, it has a number of advantages. You can handle the low-hanging fruit first. You don't have to touch the core system. You don't have big impacts. Just refactor small systems one at a time. Makes it really easy to parallelize. A person working here and a person working here, they're not going to break each other. They're not going to run into each other. And lets you unravel the knots bit by bit without having to run into a big wall all at once. On the other hand, you don't have that code side by side as well. So there's a lot less incentive to actually fix things and actually do things the new way if it's just little bits and pieces that are done the new style. It's a lot less impactful. Okay, this one system over here may be nice and clean and have unit tests, but the rest of the system is still a black box of spaghetti that I don't know how to deal with, so I still can't actually make changes to my system. And that big break is still going to happen at some point. You're just delaying the inevitable. When you have this level of refactor, when you are essentially rebuilding a system from the inside out, there will come a point where suddenly the world changes. It's going to happen. You're just pushing that off. Taking a top-down approach, which is more what we did in Drupal 8, you can do the high visibility stuff first. In our case, that was the routing system. That way, everyone knows what's going on. You're all in. And you can identify, okay, this is hard, this is hard, this is hard, this is hard. That's the stuff we need to work on next. Because those are the big places that things are going to break. It also gives a better contrast with the old code, because then everyone is going to be seeing new and old side by side all the time, which could be good or bad, depending on your organization. It is higher risk, though, because when you're changing big core systems, there's a good chance you're going to break big core things. It's kind of how it works. There are a lot of knots, and you don't necessarily have the experience yet to know, okay, if I pull on this thread, these other 6 things are going to break. And there could be a lot of easy stuff you never get to. For example, in Drupal, we have a mechanism for letting code set a message that will get stored in the session, gets shown on the next user page, like Symfony Flash messages, same basic idea. The API for that is still a function. Why is that still a function? Because we never quite got there. We'll fix it in 8.1, but really, it's a small little thing. We never quite got there because we're busy with other stuff. And that just annoys me. So keep that in mind. So which approach do you take? Top down or bottom up? Which is going to be better? Who wants to say top down? Who wants to say bottom up? So about even split there. It's going to depend on your organization, because the right approach technically and the right approach politically may have nothing to do with each other. And unfortunately, the political one has to win. In Drupal's case, we needed the top down, we needed the big break early to galvanize people. We needed that messaging of saying, we are going to change everything, get ready. In a different code base, a different organization, different company, you may do it the other way around. You need to look at your organization and figure out which is going to work better. But you do need to have very clear messaging. Clear messaging is absolutely critical to any plan to change anything. And you're going to have to repeat your message over and over and over and over again, because everyone is going to want to hear it themselves. Sending out an email is not enough. Sending out a blog post is not enough. And you're going to need to repeat it in different ways for different people, and they will still come up and ask you, every time. I'd been working on the Whiskey Initiative as the Whiskey lead, saying explicitly, this is what we're going to do. This is our mission statement. Posting blog posts, posting forum posts, having IRC meetings, talking about it at conferences. And a year later, I still had people walking up to me at conferences and going, so Larry, what's this web services initiative you're doing? I'm like, really? Do you read anything I write? Do you do any research? No, people don't. Even if you're in a company, nobody's going to actually listen to the email from the boss. It's just not happening. It's a complete and total waste of time to have your senior engineers doing tech evangelism. It is a complete and total waste of time to have the people who should be writing code spending their time explaining why we need to rewrite code. And you have to do it anyway, because it's just not going to happen otherwise. This took me a very long time to accept. That's the best way to put it. I don't like doing that kind of evangelism. I would rather just be writing the code and proving the point that way. You have to do both. It just doesn't work otherwise. Because there are costs, serious costs to poor messaging. Again, open source or commercial. Because people are going to learn at different rates. If you start changing things, you start moving people's cheese, then some people are going to get it really quickly, some are going to take longer, some will never get it. You have to be prepared for that. People will respond badly if you move their cheese without telling them, because everything they know is now different. Their expertise is no longer expert. You have to figure out how to account for that. Not everyone is going to make that transition. If you're a company and you start refactoring things and heavily rebuilding your system, you will lose people. There will be people who would rather leave than come along. You have to be okay with that. You have to decide, is that worth it? And will you get more people than you lose? Will you attract more people to the project, more people to the company than you lose? I would say yes. We even had a fork. There's a fork of Drupal called Backdrop. That is the people who don't like all the changes we made in Drupal 8. It's a very small fork at this point, but it happens. People left loudly. I think the fact we've tripled the size of our developer community means that we definitely attracted more people than we lost, but we did lose some. You have to be prepared for that. Amateurs think about tactics, professionals think about logistics. This is something I said very early on in the project. Give me 5 people, 10 hours a week, and I can refactor anything you want. Give me 50 people, 1 hour a week, and I am completely useless. This is what I said in 2011, and in 2012, and 2013, and 2014. Never actually changed. That's a problem with volunteer projects, because you have lots of people who want to help in 10-minute increments, and you just can't get work done in 10-minute increments. Meetings happen in hour-long increments. Actual work happens in a 4-hour increment. If you're in an in-house, it's an in-house project at a company, who's working on a code base in-house of some kind? Okay, wow, most of you. You've got some kind of dev tools of your own. How often do those actually get prioritized? Working on your own tool chain? Pretty rarely. Who's at an agency of some kind? A couple people? Yeah, in-house projects just don't happen, do they? Telling people that they have to improve the quality of their own lives in nights and weekends is an insult. It's how an open source community works, unfortunately. But if you want to do this, you have to commit the time. You have to commit the resources. You have to commit the people. Who here is a dev manager of some kind? Management and up? If you want to do this, you have to give people time to do it specifically. It's not going to happen on the edges, because they'll just not bother. It can't happen in 1-hour increments. Work does not happen in spare time, because let's face it, how much of us actually have spare time? In Drupal, we're a very distributed community, people literally around the world. So we hold sprints. These are small, in-person collaboration meetings held literally all around the world with a small group of people with dedicated time, and it's the right people. It's not just whatever 5 people happen to be around. It's the maintainer of this subsystem, this initiative lead, this specialist, this generalist, the right people in the room together with FaceTime talking. This could be useful for getting code written or really for planning and architecting. If you give 3 people 3 days to work together on something, they can get an unbelievable amount done. We are one of the largest distributed teams in the world, 3,000 people on 6 continents, and that's only because penguins can't type. And we still get the most done when we meet in person. Also, beware of bike shedding. Anytime you make big changes, you invite bike shedding. You're all familiar with the bike shed concept, right? If you try to build a nuclear power plant, then everyone's just going to nod and smile at whatever your plan is because they don't understand it at all, and they don't want to demonstrate they don't understand it. Try to build a bike shed, though, everyone knows how to build those, so everyone has an opinion. Even if it's stupid, even if it has no value, everyone has an opinion, they will want to share it. Prepare for that. Best example in Drupal 8, our new configuration system. This is probably the biggest user-facing feature change in Drupal 8. Long story short, all the staging and deployment problems you have in older versions of Drupal have been solved. Thank you very much. Back in 2011, we had a 3-day sprint in Denver. 5 people. I was one of them. 5 people, the right people, spent 3 days just talking, planning, architecting, figuring out how this thing's going to work. Came back with a very detailed recommendation for how this would work. We posted it in public. We had our configuration file stored on disk instead of on the database. We had a system defined for how we were going to load that configuration, how it's going to work. We knew what the API was going to look like. We knew how we would do staging. It's a really detailed plan for how this thing was going to work. And really the only thing we hadn't settled on firmly was, are those files on disk going to be JSON, YAML, or XML? What is the one thing people actually cared about in this report? That's all anyone wanted to talk about, was arguing file formats. None of the actual stuff that mattered. We eventually ended up picking JSON because it was easy to parse. Later on, we moved to YAML instead because JSON doesn't have documentation support and its UTF-8 support is poor. And in hindsight, for what we actually ended up with at the end of the day, personally, I think XML would have been a better fit than YAML, but politically, changing was impossible. Nothing to do with technical. This was a political decision, not a technical one. How do you stop bike sheds? Oh God, I could do an entire session just on this. Strong leadership. You have to have clear, strong leadership. A good leader is one who knows how and when to say shut up in a way that people will appreciate. You need people who have that level of respect and can leverage it properly. And you need to explain the reason behind everything. Your decision-making process has to be clear, and you need to over-communicate. In subsequent sprints, when we had big planning meetings, when we posted our report, it was even longer. But we explained, we considered this and decided against it for this reason. We considered this and decided against it for this reason. We considered this and decided against it for this reason. Which meant we already predicted what the objections were going to be and took care of those first. It didn't completely resolve that problem, but it did help a great deal. And luck helps too. Sometimes you can't control it, you just have to hope for the best. All right, so now you know what you're doing, you know what your strategy is, you know if you're going top down or bottom up, you have plans, you're going to give people time to do it, you've given people the space to do it. So tactically now, how do we work on it? How do we actually get it done? Well, proper prior planning prevents piss-poor performance. This is all planning here. This is still all, not writing code. This is logistics. This is planning. This is getting the things lined up. First thing I'll say, don't write unit tests. I'm sorry, Chris. Really. Don't kill me. It's okay. First thing you do is write system tests. If your code were easy to unit test, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation if writing unit tests was actually feasible. That's why we're doing it. Also, we're going to be changing what those units are. That's, again, the point. The unit tests are going to change with the code. As you write new code, as you refactor the new stuff, oh yeah, unit test that. Unit test that, all night long or something, I don't know. But along the way, you make sure that you don't break user functionality. That's what the system tests are for, to make sure you're not breaking user functionality. It also means you want all of your tests passing at all times without exception. Period. Someone approves. In our case, we wrote our own testing framework because it was 2008 when we added it, and at the time, Travis CI didn't exist, Circle CI didn't exist, whatever. But having those tests, having those pretty poorly written integration tests saved our butts over and over and over again. Having those tests, crappy as they were, made it possible to work. These days, please don't write your own. You've got Behat, you've got Selenium. These days, I would say just use Behat, don't bother with Selenium. But the tools are there, use them. They're easy enough now, there's no excuse. Get the integration test in place first so that you can make sure you don't break things on your users. But use those functional tests for functional tests. Don't use them as surrogate unit tests. Pseudo unit tests, they are worse than not having anything. Because this actually happened a ton in Drupal 7. There's this function here. We want to test this function. How do we do that? Well, it's too spidered into everything else. So we're going to have our test boot up the entire system, run an install, create a piece of content, and poke this one button to see what happens, to test this one function. Please don't do that. It's not worth the effort. Really. You just mark that as, this needs to get refactored because I can't write a unit test for it. There's your guideline. As you're writing new code, as you're refactoring, share it. Share it with everybody, especially yourself. Who wants to maintain crappy code? Who wants to maintain your own crappy code? Exactly. So use someone else's crappy code instead. Because then they're responsible for it. Which is really the entire point of open source. Don't do work you don't have to because someone else is sharing their solution with you. When writing new functionality for your system, whatever it is, whether it's low-level, high-level user functionality, it doesn't matter. Your first response should not be to write something new. Your first response is to see if someone else already wrote it and you can just use it. Maybe the answer is no, that's okay, but at least try, at least look. Because that means, hey, look, not only do I not have to write this code, I don't have to maintain it, I don't have to write tests for it, someone else already did. Win! All the YAML file that Drupal has, we didn't write our own YAML parser. There was never any serious discussion and an attempt to write our own YAML parser because Symfony has one. And we were already using Symfony components. So let's just use their YAML parser because who wants to write a YAML parser? I didn't think so. Also, if you have to write something yourself, share it with yourself. Build it as a separate component. Build it as a new library that you can then share with your own code base and with everyone else. Because it's a standalone component, it is a small greenfield project. Cool. Take the time and do it right because it's a greenfield project. And then stick it on Packagist, please. Release it as open source. In Drupal's case, we actually have a section of our code base set aside for components that are not yet released separately, but could be. And we're working on getting those spun off so they could be released on Packagist separately as their own packages. It's hard. It actually, I'd say, is easier if you keep them in separate repositories because the temptation to sneak in a new dependency without realizing it is very high. It's actually really hard to keep our components cleanly separated. For existing functionality you already have, you've probably heard this advice before. Do not replace your app, just refactor it. Because if you try to replace the whole thing, you will never actually finish. For individual pieces, though, don't try and save them. If they're bad, swap out that piece, that subsystem, with something new. Good example here, Drupal HTTP request. This is the Drupal 7 HTTP client. It supported HTTP 1.0, not 1.1. It is a single 304-line function. Really? With an NPath complexity of about 25.3 billion. For those who don't understand NPath complexity, that roughly means if you started writing unit tests for it today, you would not finish before the heat death of the universe. Yes, it's bad. And even then, it didn't have an awful lot of features that you need these days to work on the web. So we killed it and replaced it with Guzzle. Just delete, drop Guzzle in instead. Thank you. And we worked with the Guzzle team. Actually, Guzzle 3, this is going back a couple of years, Guzzle 3 broke up from one big package to several small packages for us. Because we only wanted to pull in the core system. We didn't want all of the multiple megabytes worth of extensions. So they broke it up for us so that we could use it. Working with people actually pays off. That said, you don't replace everything. Only replace things if you actually need to. There is a cost to outsourcing. There is a cost to using someone else's code because it's someone else's code, not yours. You can't change it on a whim. We're still using our own database layer. We have not swapped it out for Doctrine. Why? Because our database layer was the only part of the system that was actually clean. So why waste time changing that just to say we did? Didn't need to. Maybe we will in the future. I don't know, but we didn't need to. Automate everything. I said before, you want 100% green tests? Always, every day. If you do not have a CI server running, if you do not have continuous integration, if you do not have this happening automatically, it will not happen. People are not going to pause and run your full test suite on their own. Your code review process must include automation for running your test suite. Period. In our case, again, we built our own. It's kind of terrible, but it saved us from doing terrible, terrible things every single day in the last 4 years. Please don't write your own at this point. Better tools out there, use Travis CI, use Circle CI, build something with Jenkins, I don't care. Have something that is automating your test suite. Otherwise, you will break everything daily. And that includes performance. We didn't have automated testing on performance for Drupal 8. We never have. Which meant that it got slower and slower and slower and slower, bit by bit by bit by bit, over time. Until Drupal 8, we started getting benchmarks and like, oh wow, that thing's slow. Okay, now what do we do? We've done a lot of work to crawl that back, and Drupal 8 should be fine on performance when it ships real soon now. But you have to track this. If you don't track it automatically, it's not going to get tracked. It's not that object-oriented code is slower. It's not. What's slower is you're breaking all of your old optimizations. You're breaking all of your old assumptions. So you need to catch those and do something about them. And finally, the best is the enemy of the good. Okay, he's quoting Voltaire, whatever. He's my dad, I have to reference him. All this kind of idealism is a guide. It is not a hard and fast rule. If you can make incremental progress, take it. Incremental progress is still progress. This can be hard if you don't have a clear deadline for things, if you don't know what your scope is. One of the challenges with Drupal development is historically when we start working on a new major version, the deadline for when it's going to be closed is when Dries decides it is. Dries is our project lead, so that makes it hard. Have clear milestones and clear checkpoints. For example, I would say go ahead and use a service locator. What? Paul's not here to make fun of me, so I have to do it myself. Would someone else like to yell at me for that? Okay. But service locators are evil, right? They're terrible. Well, all they are is a DI container that you're passing around. That's it. Which means if you're using a service container, you have a DI container that stuff is in. This is progress. This is huge progress if you're coming from a bunch of functions that call each other willy-nilly. This is still good. Remember, incremental steps, 1 byte at a time. In Drupal 8, we have this nice global class with a whole bunch of statics in it. that is tracking our dependency injection container. And you can grab any service out of it from pretty much anywhere, and we've got a couple of utility methods. This is terrible. This is horrible. This is static globals. But it's one static global. Only one, which is way better than having lots of them lying around at random. You're only supposed to use this in the procedural code that remains in Drupal. If you use this inside the object-oriented code, I will slap you. But we still have procedural code in there. We needed something. Which means you've got a block of code like this. This is some legacy procedural code. Fine. It's doing its thing. It's calling out to the module handler system, doing its stuff, calling out to the plugin manager block service, whatever. Fine. Yeah, this is gross. This is ugly. I don't care, because that module handler and that plugin manager, those are cleanly factored services. This is still a huge benefit. This is still a huge step forward. Take it. There's another code example. It's in a class where we just took procedural code and dumped it into a class. That was step one. That's progress. Didn't do any injection, just dumped it into a class. Then we can start refactoring it and move the service out to this utility method. Great. Now this code is nice and clean. We've got the ugly here. Then we can refactor that. Bite-sized steps. Forward progress is the important part. Service locators are a stepping stone toward dependency injection. You're going to break things in steps. In most cases, it's better to break things in steps. You're going to break things. When you refactor something, you're going to break APIs. When you do this level of change, when you're rebuilding a system like this, you will break APIs. Deal. Having some backward compatibility shims are your friend. That's just keep a backward compatibility layer in place. But market deprecated. This is something we did fairly well, I think, in Drupal 8. Have the old function still around, but it's just a front to whatever your new system is. That way, the rest of the code doesn't have to get converted all at once in a 5 megabyte patch. You can do it piecemeal. And you can have lots of different people work on it. If you're an open source project, this is a great way to get people onboarded, is just doing this cleanup work. Because then they're doing work. They're getting used to working on your project. This is a good experience for juniors, refactoring code to use a new API. You probably heard this statement then. Nothing is more permanent than a temporary solution. If you've got these backward compatibility shims, yeah, the temptation is going to be there to just leave them forever. This just takes commitment. This just takes a commitment from management, from your process, from your development team to say, we will not leave them there forever. Mark things deprecated. There's a lot of options here. Mark them as deprecated in your API. Many IDEs will actually flag that as you're writing code to say, hey, by the way, this thing is broken. This thing is old. And once you've deprecated something, never, ever, ever add new usages of it. Any new code coming in, any new patches, any new pull requests, use the new API. Because you're doing code review, right? Right? You're doing code review? The correct answer is yes. Thank you. Document it. In Drupal, we have a formal change notice system where when you change an API, you post a particular node type on Drupal.org. There's a complete index of them. You can search it. You can order them. It goes out on Twitter. You have to have this kind of communication in place. Peer review. We'll say this one again. Peer review. Show people, oh, by the way, we changed this API. Here's the new one. Oh, I'm reviewing this code and it's got this new style system. How does that work? Oh, that's the new one. Oh, cool. Okay, now I know. Peer review is an excellent educational tool, both for the reviewer and for the person being reviewed. Maybe throw e-user deprecated. We actually didn't do this in Drupal, but it's an option that's there. Just use trigger error if someone calls one of the old functions. Then if you keep calling old functions, your logs will fill up with messages saying, stop doing that. Have a sunset plan. Is it a release blocker to finish removing this old API? Maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't. Either way is a fair answer, but be explicit about it. Make that a deliberate decision. It also means change sets that are just fixing stuff, removing legacy code, just refactoring the system, must be acceptable. It must be okay. You must accept patches that are just improving the code quality. Early on in Drupal 8 cycle, a lot of our patches didn't add any user functionality. They were just refactoring something, just moving code around, just building some new subsystem without using it. And a lot of our code reviewers, especially our project leadership, were like, I don't get it. What's the point? What's the value of this? That slowed us down. That attitude was harmful. And it took a while for people to get the idea of stepwise improvements, of doing things in bite-sized pieces is actually better, which means, yes, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic is okay if it gets you closer to a lifeboat. You're making progress. There has to be intrinsic value seen in code quality. If there is not, you have a management problem. You do not have a technical problem, you have a management problem. And that needs to get fixed. That just must be okay. Also, don't bite off more than you can chew. Session handling. We had our own session handling system in Drupal 7, and we wanted to switch to symphonies because, well, it's already there in our code base, you might as well. And we tried doing it in one big patch, and after 2 years, it still didn't work. 2 years. So we broke it up into just like 10 different patches over the course of a while, and like 5 different people working on it over a year and a half, and that worked. If we had stuck to trying to do it all at once, it would never have happened. 8 of those patches, I think, were just moving code around, reorganizing our old code so that it looked like the new code so we could swap it out for the new code. You have to be able to do that. You have to be willing to do that. Procedural code inside of a class is progress. It's not where you want to be, but it's progress. A good example here. There's the core engine of our form system in Drupal, the form builder class. Holy God, there's 10 dependencies. That's terrible. You should reject code like that. Why is this here? Because now we know that there's 10 dependencies. When this was all procedural, we didn't know that. At least now we know. And now we can refactor and iterate from here and figure out, okay, do we actually need some of these? Can we reduce these? Can we break it out better? We now know the question to ask, and that's good. Meanwhile, that old procedural code turned into a bunch of dumb wrappers. They're all deprecated. All they're doing is forwarding to the new system, which meant we didn't need to rewrite every single form in the system all at once in one day, because that would never have worked. But later on, we did remove those. These functions no longer exist in Drupal 8 because they don't need them. No program you write is ever going to be perfect. Campfire rule. Leave it better than you found it, even if it's just a little bit. Contain the crappiness. There will be crappy parts of your code, just keep it contained. Keep it to certain classes. Yes, this is terrible, but all of the other code that's calling it is fine. All 10 of those dependencies are pretty straightforward and clean and have a relatively small number of dependencies themselves. We know where the ugly parts are, and they're contained, and we can then work on those. And we've already got patches ready and waiting to simplify this in 8.1. Know when to push for better, and know when to just say, you know what, this is good enough for now. But at the same time, good enough is also the enemy of the good. My recommendation, interfaces. Getting clean interfaces in your system is worth fighting for. It is worth going toe-to-toe with someone to make sure you get that clean separation between subsystems. The code inside the subsystem, whatever. You'll get to that later. That's not always worth the fight. It is worth it to fight for the interfaces because then you are carving up the problem. You are dividing and conquering. You are saying, I know this code over here is terrible. We'll get there, but at least it's bounded here. It's terrible in this box, and I can fix this part over here without worrying about this. This is going to be an ongoing process. As I said, in some form or another, I've been working on this in Drupal since 2008. It's a long process. And at times, it's going to feel like you're just pushing a boulder up a hill with cat pictures over and over again. But you are making progress. You are moving forward. You are changing people's minds. You are working forward. You are making a progress. You are accomplishing things. One bite at a time. One bite at a time is how change happens. One bite at a time is how code improves. And it sounds hard, but if Drupal, that isolationist, quirky, idiomatic community that doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't go to anyone else's conferences, refuses to say that anyone else writes good code, if Drupal can pull this off, if Drupal can get off their island and refactor their entire code base in just a few years, I mean, like, we're talking hundreds of thousands of lines of code, refactored in just a few years to be modern, to be object-oriented, to be clean, to use third-party code from other systems. If we can pull it off, so can you. Anyone can make this happen. Thank you. That's it. I don't know if we have time for questions. Probably not. Okay. If you have questions, I'll be around here. Feel free to ask about Drupal or refactoring or whatever else. Actually, yes. We do have a special announcement. Please come back.
Hang on, sit down, just 1 second. Come up here. All right, come up here. This is not meant to be funny, okay. Those of us who know you and follow you on Twitter, we know that most of what you tweet on Twitter is performance hard.
Yes.
We also, those of us who know you know when it's not, and you recently went through something, and we wanted to show you that we support you, so we got together and got you a card, had everybody sign it, because for those of you who don't know, if you don't follow Chris, he recently had to put down one of his cats. We've also made a donation.
And I know that seems funny, because given how I act on Twitter, people probably think
But no,
that'd be like the last thing that I would
those of us who know you know when the performance art stops. We also made a donation in your name to the World Wildlife Federation, yes. And you're going to get a little stuffed tiger.
Oh, cool.
We wanted to bring you one here, but we couldn't get it in time, and we kind of figured a live cat was right out. So now, I do want to take this back. This has been signed by several people that basically the people that I know here. Everybody else, this is not you're not part of the community. I'm putting this card out at the PHP Architect booth. Please stop by and sign it, and Chris will pick it up at the end of the day. I'd really appreciate that to show that we are all part of the PHP community. So thank you.
And that hug was on camera.